I was a young man back in the 1960s. Yes, you made your own amusements then, going to the pictures. Well, the travel was hard, and I mean we still use the wheels, but you could sit down at your table and eat a real food meal.
And now, WBAI presents the most mediocre of Steve Post. Excerpts from his best programs. A tribute to America's little sweetheart, semicolon, or Up the Outside. Tonight's cast includes Charles Pitts, Pope John the 23rd, Paul Krasner, Princess Lee Radziwill, Brother Theodore, the PS-94 Boys Lavatory Chorale, Jay, Robbie Barish, Marshall Efron, and by special request, the Enema Lady. Included also is the entire silent majority, the Talking Duck, and Ian Whitcomb. Test tones, fill, and white noise by Steve Post.
Is the mic on? Ah, there we got it. You see what I mean? To start all over again, we'll just fix that in post. My name is Frank, and I am a recovering WBAI manager. Although I feel like in the last few weeks I might have been doing more research. All of us who knew and loved Steve know that this is exactly the kind of event that he would have refused to attend. But we're sure happy that you came out in this rather inclement weather. They're not of Steve's persuasion, but are here with us tonight. So joining with other friends of Steve to remember him together. Steve would have appreciated the irony that is here simultaneously his birthday, the first day of spring, a snowstorm, and something called the International Happiness Day. It's kind of hard to digest, but I'm not judging, I'm just saying. Well, okay, let's get this thing underway. I'm joined by my friend, my co-MC and fellow cat herder, Sarah Fishko. As you surely know, Sarah is the host and producer of the Fishko Files on WNYC and has won more awards than I ever even knew existed. She is now hard at work on a film based on her Jazz Loft series, also on WNYC. And I hope you all heard the lovely tribute she did in August, just days after Steve's death. Sarah, save me from myself.
All right, enough already. Let's thank some people.
Let's go ahead and do it.
We want to start by thanking David Rapkin, a.k.a. Rap, Peter Zanger, a.k.a. Zang, known to some as Rap Zang Productions. Thank you for pointing that out. They produced, Rap Zang, David Rapkin and Peter Zanger produced the opening tape this evening, and they are to be thanked profusely. A hand for them, please. And we also want to say a few words about Laura Rosenberg. For the better part of 50 years, Laura Rosenberg was Steve Post's partner. Surely no picnic, but possibly a feast of some kind. So we want to say some more about her.
This event has refreshed the stale term of a labor of love. And the term love's labor is lost does not apply here. Laura Rosenberg Post has been the guiding light and inspiration and drive behind this entire thing. And I think we want to give her...
Let's give her a round of applause.
And I want to also thank, with massive amounts of gratitude, Maud Brickner, whose organizational skill and iron will have kept this project from going off track at many junctures, like daily.
A round of applause, please. And we need to thank our tech team, Danny Cornyetz, and again, Peter Zanger and Ed Woodard, who really, I can't say enough about how they held this together. And also Andy Lancet, who unfortunately couldn't make it tonight, but as the WNYC archivist, he has helped in every possible way.
Big thanks to the WNYC's chief, Laura Walker, for all her moral and material support of this event. From all of us, thank you very much, Laura, and for the flowers, too. They're beautiful. Tonight's event is, of course, a tribute to the memory of our friend Steve Post, but it is also the initiation of a larger and longer tribute, the creation of the Steve Post Archive Project, which is an effort to archive, catalog, and distribute Steve's 50 years of work. This is the commercial. We want to direct your attention to the last page of the program guide you got, and for information on how to make a tax-deductible gift to this effort. It provides a mailing address, but myself, I could almost never get to the snail mail. I can't find an envelope. I can't find a postage stamp. And if you're like that, feel free to hand the check over to me or Sarah or one of the other speakers or anybody else who looks like they have some amount of official capacity. Now, Sarah.
Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce a long-time Steve Post fan who listened to and loved him for years before becoming the president and CEO of New York Public Radio. That's right, Laura Walker, his fan who became his boss.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much, Laura, for inviting me to speak really on behalf of the current staff at WNYC, former staff, many of whom are here, and our board. And Sarah's right. Long before I became president of WNYC, I was a listener. I tuned in every day to Steve Post. Like so many of you who are here today, I listened to Steve because I really never knew what he was going to say next. He was quick-witted, and he told it like it was. Sure, he was a curmudgeon, and I think you'll probably hear that word a bit today. I'm pretty sure its origins can almost be traced back to someone looking for the perfect word to describe Steve Post. But he was also honest, funny, entertaining, loving, and irresistibly refreshing. I even enjoyed listening during the pledge drives when I was a listener, and I remember one time when he wouldn't stop playing the Pachelbel canon. And I was at home, and I'm like, okay, I have had enough. I am going to pledge. So he worked his magic on me. It was effective for many more. So many of us remember him kind of, trying to get to the goal at the end of the hour. And we wanted him to succeed, and we wanted him kind of one part of you wants him to stop the antics and one part of you wants him to continue. Anyone who listened to Steve knew, though, that he loved to hate authority of all kinds. And I loved to listen to him hate authority when I was a listener, that is. But when I became his boss, the proverbial bullseye on his target, well, let's just say I loved it a little less. I remember when I signed on to be the first president of the independent WNYC, I wasn't all that afraid of raising the $20 million to purchase the radio licenses from the city. I figured there were so many people out there, we could do that. Building a truly independent radio station for New York didn't give me much of a moment's pause, but I had a pit in my stomach over the prospect of being Steve Post's boss, because this was the man who had called one of my predecessors. You remember Mary Perrott Nichols? He called her, when she was president of WNYC, future ex-president for life. And during one fundraiser, some of you may remember, he did an elaborate bit depicting a helicopter landing on the top of the municipal building to whisk ex-President Nichols away before law enforcement could get to her for her many crimes. So this was also the man, you may remember, who locked himself in a bathroom on the 25th floor of the municipal building, and then thought that the best course of action on that gusty, frigid March morning was to climb out the bathroom window onto the building's ledge. And many of you may remember him telling the story or reading about it in Newsday and Marty Goldenson's wonderful piece, which said, Steve Post begins to cry. And he Spider-Maned his way back to the control room. This was a violation of every possible rule in the book. So manage that? To give you a sense of what it was like to try to manage Steve Post, I dug up an old performance review. It's right here. And it was written by John Schaefer, Steve's boss. John is here somewhere. Where are you, John? There he is, right there. John, who was hired in 1981, the same year that Steve was hired. Steve was hired at the beginning of that year, John at the end of the year. It was a very, very good year for WNYC. But at some point, John became his boss, and there were these performance appraisals. And this particular form has a few categories. You see, as president, I have access to the secret files and the secret tapes. And so I dug this up, and it has these categories: quality, productivity, reliability, and so on. So like a good employee, John dutifully filled in the boxes as best as he could. In Steve's case, in the category of independence, for example, he wrote, "Steve wouldn't have it any other way." But my favorite part comes at the end. You know, there are these different categories. The highest one is creativity. He gets almost perfect scores for creativity. He gets almost really bad scores for adherence to policy. Instead of answering a bunch of questions at the end, John just wrote his own thing. And he said, "This form is almost completely useless in evaluating Post's performance. He's hard to work with, distrustful of management, curmudgeonly, loose-lipped, pampered, and unpredictable. He's also funny, sincere, effective, at least at fundraising time, honest, brutally so, and unpredictable. His value to WNYC is not reflected in a form that gives creativity equal weight to adherence to policy." And in true form, Steve wrote at the bottom, "I agree with John Schaefer's statement regarding this form. I will therefore not sign." Just perfect Steve. So Steve did his thing. He spoke from his heart. He spoke obviously with cynicism and with wit, but he also spoke really from his heart. And I remember through all the jokes and kind of being a little bit of the target for him, he spoke so effectively about the need to preserve WNYC for generations to come. And he said that over and over again. And WNYC is here today in large part because Steve made that plea and so many people answered. He had an incredibly special bond with his listeners, like me and like you, and that's why we all loved him so dearly. Thank you.
Up next is David Amram. Among many other things, composer and instrumentalist David Amram is notable for having played the William Tell Overture on his own skull with his knuckles at the request of Steve Post, to raise funds during a WBAI marathon, which I'm sure it did. I'll let him tell you the rest. David?
Just like to thank all of you for being here. Seeing so many old friends is like going to heaven without the drag of expiring. And thinking of Steve and Larry Josephson and Bob Fast when we would go up there in the 60s to help raise funds for WBAI, one of the things that Steve thought might possibly help to get people out of their torpor or lethargy would be to play something on my skull. Since I'll be 85 this November, I'll spare that because my skull can't handle it, and it wasn't really particularly good, and I'm not sure that it helped out the William Tell Overture to gain in popularity, but it did serve a purpose, because one night when no one was calling in, Steve said, I'm going to make my world debut and farewell performance improvising a piano concerto while David's playing on his skull, and we'll continue doing that until you send in money. So just before my skull collapsed and the poor old piano at WBAI fell into a complete state of destruction, more people called in for that than anything else that we've ever done over the years, which proved the mantra we both shared, which is never let good taste stand in the way of a good time. Since I was going to play the piano, but because the curtain's down, WBAI, one of the specialties, just as in life, is when in doubt, improvise. So I'm going to do something different than I planned, and hopefully, as long as we think about Steve, it doesn't really make any difference. This is going to be miraculously short because I'm only going to do about 3 minutes and then accompany one of my favorite people of all time and one of Steve's very best friends. So this will be a very, very short, abbreviated version of the first and last performance for Steve in E minor. Just a little thought for Steve Post from the Bronx. You don't have to have any angst, because if you want in this Philistine world a reprieve, just listen to any of the old archival tapes of Mr. Steve. He raised your spirits, made you feel high. On our favorite old radio station of yesteryear and today, WBAI. He's someone that we love the most. So merci bien et toda rabba, good old Steve Post. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now for a special treat. There's a young man sitting in the front row whom I had the joy of meeting in the early 1960s. And he and Steve and I and Larry Josephson used to bagel up a storm, and in order to give him the proper introduction, and I will accompany him in some way, I was going to do it on the piano, but I'm not sure I can crash through, so I'll just use the hand drum. Frank Millspaugh will give him the introduction that he deserves so richly.
Well, no one could give Bob the introduction that he deserves, but will say this. In fact, I think it's fair to say that Bob is a man who truly needs no introduction, so I will go beyond mere necessity. Bob Fass is a 50-plus years veteran of New York radio, starting at WBAI in 1963. He's a pioneer of freeform radio, and he was dubbed midwife to the birth of the counterculture. He arguably created DJ mixing techniques as well as the flash mob. He continues to broadcast his show Radio Unnameable on WBAI on Thursday nights at midnight. And now there's a few other words to be said.
I first came to WBAI. I was hired over the telephone to come work at WBAI. I was told I would be working on the program guide, the listings of the programs. And when I got there, they made me the bookkeeper, notwithstanding the fact that I'd flunked bookkeeping in every single math course in school. And I had to get Bob Bass to fill out a form in order to get him on the payroll. And that's how I met Bob Bass. And I made a little nasty comment to him. I'd heard him, his voice, I was used to his voice. I'd heard it coming out of the monitors, which were always up around the radio station. And I went downstairs to the switchboard in the reception area, and I asked Bob Bass to fill this out, and I made a wise remark like, "You guys have an easy job up there in the studio." And he said, "You think so? Come up." And that was the beginning. I went up to the studio after I got finished not keeping the books that day. And Bob began to teach me about radio.
Good evening, Caballero.
Well, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity to say something that I've just begun to realize myself. Stevie, I hardly knew you. I hardly knew you. You were at WBAI. You came to WBAI with all of your hopes and dreams out there in front of you. And we gave you a place to do your dance. But you had a kind of a creative, wonderful imagination that made you see art where there sometimes was only accident, which of course is hallucinatory art, and you recognized it. You have a wonderful chapter in this book of yours, which I'm reading maybe for the 5th time, playing in the FM band, where you're driving down from upstate New York, and you hear this wonderful radio program that mixes Mantovani and Kate Smith and jazz classics and rock and roll and folk music and bits of news. And as you get closer to the city, you realize that it's not some kind of mix, some new age psychedelic mix. It's 2 stations coming in on the same frequency. But your imagination turned it into art, just as you did when you were tired of talk radio and you saw an opera and you decreed that people could call and put their voices on the air with their opinions, but everything they said had to be sung. Everything they said had to be done as though it were recitative. And it was a wonderful program. It was recorded and rebroadcast by Eric Saltzman, who was our music director at the time, placed on in the morning music. And when you went to WNYC, this was a whole other world that you created. That's the part about you that I really didn't know. I didn't know enough about the things that you did there and how, I mean, I could listen sometimes and I could hear you I don't know, I mean, I could hear you listening when there were certain pieces of music that were being played. I could hear you singing when there were reports of atomic accidents. There would be a chorus that Steve would lead people in when there was the report of an accident in an atomic facility that made it absolutely clear that no one in the audience, and least of all Steve, thought that this facility was safe for men, women, children, and the world. I don't know, there's a kind of, people say this so often when someone dies, that there is a hole in the fabric of the universe where they were, that somehow without them, there's a real feeling of absence. And I believe that every time I listen to the concert music on the radio or even the news, I feel the absence. I felt that you were absent when you were still on the planet sometimes. And Steve, I miss you. I know that your death came after long years of suffering, and I felt like I was just getting to know you in a way when you left us. And I want to say to Laura and to all the people like myself who love you and who miss you, that we're just grateful that the universe produced someone as wonderful as you. Thank you, Steve.
Hello. Paul Krasner is next. Post called him a kind of countercultural Renaissance man. He joins us on video, but first here are a few words from Steve.
Oh, you have a Tootsie Roll lollipop and you didn't bring cherry flavor and you didn't bring me one?
I only had one. I had two, but I had given one to somebody.
Well, you can't.
I would have given you one if I had another one, I swear.
Unless you have enough for the whole class. That's really unfair because it's been like many, many years since I've had a Tootsie Roll lollipop cherry. And they're like my favorites in the whole world.
Well, you have a thermos bottle. I don't have a thermos bottle.
That's true, but I'm willing to share with you from my thermos bottle, except that you don't drink what's in my thermos bottle.
Well, you could lick my Tootsie Pop if you'd like.
I'll pass.
Hey, Steve, I wish you were sitting there with everybody else. Anyway, I have a lot of memories about being with you on air. Steve used to have me as a guest on a show frequently, and it was on Saturday night. And I would go there. He would invite me. I would never ask to come on because I didn't want to put him on the spot. And I remember one night in particular, he didn't call me. And so I thought, okay, I'll just take some acid and stay home and listen to music. And then he called. And just as I realized I was beginning to, not peak quite yet, but you knew it was on its way. And so I took a subway to the radio station. I didn't get right onto the subway train because I sat on the bench in the station there and just watched all of the people's footprints who had ever been on there entering a train. I could see all those footprints going. So I took the next train that came along. And for some reason, Steve, maybe somebody had given him a jar of guava, and we tasted it. And he liked it, and I loved it because I could feel it in my toes as I was tripping. And suddenly, we got the giggles about guava. The name seemed funny. The more you said it, the funnier it seems. Guava, guava, guava. And people started calling in and giving some other aspect of guava, and we got the giggles, and we were hysterical, and people listening were hysterical. And just when you thought that you had the hysteria overcome, it would come out in another burst. It was shock and awe of giddiness. And it became a kind of meme then. We didn't even know the word meme, or if we did, we probably thought it was me. And so that became a running gag. It made people run away and gag. And so another time, which was really the strangest thing we did, because Steve was going out of town, and he asked if I would want to take over his show for that evening. And I said sure, and I was pleased that he asked me to do it. And so I had two others with me on the station. Marshall Efron, who was a great character actor, and Bridget Potter, and we all three took fake names because what happened was we decided to do a prank. And so we told the listening audience that we were students at Columbia University. This was in 1968, and there was a mass protest at Columbia University. So I said that we were three students in a media class at university, and that we were taking a course in all kinds of media. And so I said that we had to do a term paper or an action that would serve for that semester. And so we decided to do an action. And I explained to the invisible audience that we were three students there. We chose to take a radio station over and like hijack a radio station, but in a stationary position. And so we gave each other, let's see, Marshall Efron was Rudy Dutschke, Bridget Potter was Emma Goldman, and I was Danny the Red. And I spoke in a nasal voice and kept saying things like, "The air belongs to the people. The air belongs to the people." And we went on for a little while, and then it sounded real, and KNBC on the West Coast started streaming it live, and several other stations did. And at one point, the cops came, and I told the cops, "No, we were just we're playing a hoax. It's okay. We're not really taking over the station." And so the police left, and then I got back on the air and said, "Oh boy, did we fool that cop? We told them we were just doing a prank, and they believed it. So now," and we went back to being the three hijackers. And so the cops came again. They didn't like being fooled. So, so that was fun. We thought it would be just for 15 minutes, and it took 4 hours that we were on the air with that prank. And then I realized I was beginning to feel guilty that Steve had trusted me to do something on his show while he was gone. And I thought, wow, I didn't want to get him in trouble of any kind. And so I called him up and apologized. He said, no, don't apologize. I was told about it and it was great. People loved it. So I felt much relieved. Because, you know, if somebody trusts you, you don't want to betray that trust. And so, unless there's something really good in it. And so, what else? One of the things I remember about Steve was that he had a strange obsession with Richard Nixon. When he was president, he collected little items of him. I think he met him in an elevator once, but I'm not sure if they spoke or if Steve just stood there in awe. And so I told him this story about what really happened during the 18 and a half minutes. This wasn't on the air. The 18 and a half minutes that were missing from the tape that was hidden in his equipment. And so I told him that it took 18 and a half minutes for his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, to give Nixon a blowjob. And there was that moment when Steve said, really? It was like, oh, really? Please? Oh, I'd love if that happened. And I mean, I gave it a context that Nixon admitted, you know, this is nothing gay, it's just a matter of power. But anyway, there are silly memories like that. And Steve's, his departure from the earth is what was a big loss to culture and counterculture. And to his family and friends, it was an unspeakable loss. So we'll miss you, Steve, and R.I.V., rest in guava. Oh, that's a G, isn't it? But there's a V in it. So long, Steve.
If I had a friend like Miss Rosemary Woods, how simple my life would be. I'd just give all my problems to Rosemary Woods, and she would erase them for me. Each time I was wrong, or each time that I lied, or somebody made me scared, I would simply report them to Rosemary Woods, and she would make them disappear. Rosie, just you and me. How faithful can one friend be? If anyone asked, how did this come to pass? How come nothing you say is true? I would simply refer them to Rosemary Woods, and you know by now what she would do.
When we were getting ready to move the WBAI from the brownstone on 39th Street to the desanctified church on 62nd, Larry Josephson came into my office, and he was kind of huffing and puffing with anxiety and irritation, his default state. And he said, no one's in charge of designing the control rooms. They are very important. Someone has to design them. So I said, okay, so you do it. So he did, and he did a really good job, I thought. Steve, however, seems to have had some reservations.
See, this place is built in a circular pattern, so among other things, people are constantly running into each other all day long, and since most people around here basically hate each other, are barely civil, what happens is you walk around these studios and you meet someone for the first time of the day and you kind of politely nod, hi, how are you? Although some people just throw punches at each other. And then 3 minutes later, you meet them again, and this goes on all day long, and you reach that awkward stage where you don't even know whether to acknowledge that you're passing by the other person. This was done purposely, sadistically. This design was Larry Josephson's.
And I would like to now introduce Larry Josephson, as I have done many times before, to my great pleasure and often to his chagrin.
My daughter Jenny, my best production. Okay, here we go. Steve and I had a bet. Which one of us would do the other's eulogy? One bet I'm sorry I won. There's no way he can pay off. It wouldn't be a BAI event without some feedback. Anyway. Steve described himself as a D- DeWitt Clinton dropout. In fact, he was one of the most brilliant men I've ever met. Okay. Thank you, Maud. He was one of the most brilliant men I've ever met. Oh well. Steve came up with many a brilliant bon mot. He never went to college, by the way. One of his best was, just when you think you've hit bottom, you've only scratched the surface. There are many Steve stories. Once Steve was required to read an NPR spot for something called Squirrel Away. Apparently, squirrels are the cockroaches of the country. They eat everything in sight, your house, your wife, whatever. So someone came up with this substance which was non-lethal, but skewed them away. So he read the spot straight, and then he said, "And who would want to hurt the itty-bitty widow squirrels?" And Mr. Squirrelaway, who was a squirrel, heard about this and called NPR, who called WNYC, and whoever is running the place came up to Steve and said, "Would you mind apologizing?" Big mistake. Steve often told the story of an epic near-death fight I had with a cab driver returning from lunch.
I can recall one day, oh God, it's about 10 years ago, more? Long time ago, Larry and I had gone out to dinner someplace, at some place that he didn't like, which is probably about 99% of the places we've ever gone together. And we had overeaten, we got into a cab, and it was a typical New York City cab driver of that era, let me say, because they seem to have gotten a little better over the last year, in my observation.
Well, they play a recorded announcement thanking you for riding with them that's actually voiced by the head of the taxi and limousine committee.
Is that who it is? I just heard it this morning. Yeah. I thought, my God, that person sounds nasty.
I think it's Howard Safer or
No, it's a woman. It's a woman.
Oh, all right.
Anyway, so we're coming down Broadway, and Larry was not feeling well as a result of this meal, and the cab driver was barreling down Broadway at about 60 miles an hour, jamming on the brakes and then jamming on the accelerator. And then Larry said to him, in what Larry considers to be a nice way, which others might judge differently, Larry said to the cab driver, "You think you could drive a little bit more slowly? I don't feel well." And the cab driver took umbrage at that and began screaming and yelling at Larry, and Larry began screaming and yelling back. Finally, the cab driver pulled up, I think it was at 74th and Broadway, right in front of Fairway, I remember it was. And this fight escalated. Larry tried to I guess first the cab driver tried to throw an empty New York City garbage can at Larry, and then Larry went over and started kicking the car, and then he started kicking the rear view mirrors and bending everything out of shape, and then Larry went over and got a garbage can and tried to throw it at the driver. Meanwhile, huge crowds were gathering, at 74th Street and Broadway. It was as though there was some major event going on there. And I, myself being, of course, the kind of good friend that I am, receded back into the crowd step by step. The louder this fight got, the more violent this fight got, further back I receded into the crowd. Until finally they settled their dispute somehow, not amicably. And Larry came and got me and said, "Some friend you are."
He, in fact, was a great friend. One morning, Steve played a piece of bone-jarring modern music. When it was over, after a long pause, he said, "Well, that was your medicine for this morning." Steve served for a time as WBAI's station manager, a job for which he was spectacularly ill-suited. Steve wanted the world to go away, to leave him alone. When someone came to his office needing a decision, Steve would lock the office door, instruct everyone inside to tell the intruder he wasn't there. Yet, when he had to, Steve would eventually make the right decision, according to the principles of Pacifica. Neither Steve, nor Bob, nor I could have gotten away with the stunts we pulled unless managers and boards of directors had our back. They do much more than write memos or raise money. Peter Jennings, the late starch defender of high-caste journalism, once called WNYC to complain about Steve's news. "Unprofessional," said Jennings. The station manager patiently explained that Steve's news was his personal take, uncomplicated by the facts. When Steve heard about this, he mocked Jennings on the air without mercy. Steve lived in a half-awake state on his bed, with Laura at his side, and who was always, of course, fully awake. Steve's entourage would gather around the bed. Steve was seemingly unaware of what was going on around him. Suddenly, he would pop up with a brilliant comment or joke, then return to a state of suspended animation. The Smithsonian has requested that bed for the center of a diorama celebrating Steve's life and his career, including replicas of Steve, Laura, his friends and family, uneaten Chinese food, all the cats, dogs, and birds over the years, and the enema lady. And with Aunt Sarah watching from above. Some of these are local jokes. Okay. These days, there is no one remotely like Steve on the radio anywhere, not on NPR or Pacifica, except for Bob Fass, who survives a mere 3 hours a week on WBAI. And let me say that without Bob and his generosity of spirit, I wouldn't have been on the radio, nor would have Steve, nor would half the live radio people in this audience. Steve was too threatening, or too politically incorrect, or too slow, or had too many pauses, or he skewed too old. Besides, someone might complain. Steve utterly lacked the layers of bullshit that most of us use, so as not to hurt anyone's feelings, God forbid. And Steve didn't hurt anyone's feelings, he just spoke it like it was. Steve both had politics and unshakable principles. At a WNYC staff meeting, Steve told Laura Walker, "I didn't go into public radio to sell things." Yet he sold the station brilliantly. Steve was, and still is, WNYC's champion fundraiser, raising millions while mocking the fundraisers themselves and the station's pretensions. He read confidential internal memos on the air, memos with exciting scripted pitches, along with mandatory instructions for pitchers. Don't say this, say that, do this, do that, do the other thing, which of course Steve ignored. In lesser hands, Steve's style of pitching would be an embarrassment. In Steve's hands, they were very funny and very effective. Steve's contract with the station, negotiated with Mary Nichols, contained a no censorship clause, with one exception. Steve agreed not to attack Mary's ally, Ed Koch. Steve kept his word until Koch had a stroke. When he was released from the hospital, his doctor said that the mayor had a brain of a 12-year-old. That was too much for Steve. So from then on, Steve referred to his honor as him with a 12-year-old brain. By the way, the no censorship deal was sealed by Steve and Mary smoking a joint on the roof of the 25th floor of the municipal building. Steve and I shared 50 years of triumph and tragedy, illness and recovery, too much food and wine and some other stuff, and many stories and jokes. Steve's death leaves a black hole in my life, in the lives of his friends and family, and for millions who waited for him patiently on the radio. If I were forced to choose one word to sum up Steve Post, it would have to be love. Not far beneath the curmudgeon, the cynic, the depressive, was a lover. He loved us, even if he never returned phone calls. In return, we loved him without reservation, and we always will. Thank you.
Obviously touching to hear all these people, but I'm struck by everybody calling him Steve. You'll have to forgive me, but Steve Post and I were on what I can only refer to as a last name basis. For whatever reason, from the moment we met, that was it. He called me Sarah only in jest, and especially when he was doing a bit, like he'd do a bit that started, "Sarah, my dear," you know. But that was it. The rest of the time, it was Post and Fishko all the way. In fact, all I really have to do is just think of the name, Post, and it puts me right back into that kind of bantering with Post frame of mind, which really started at about 1974 at WBAI and then reached a kind of fundraising frenzy at WNYC in the 80s and some of the 90s. Anyway, Richard Barr's working relationship and friendship with Post began in the mid-70s, about 1975, at WBAI, and he will tell you more about that. Richard.
Thank you, Sarah. So I imagine that of the people who are here who only knew Steve on the radio, at least some of you must be curious about whether the Steve you heard, the Steve you knew on the airwaves, was who he really was. So I'll try to address the fact that, yes, to a large degree, that is who he was. Anyone who knew him could tell you. But there are other things as well, and I'll try to mention a few of them until they maybe cut me off. In any case, 12 years ago, Steve and Sarah and I were sitting right at that end of the stage at a memorial for Tracy Stern, who had been, after a long career as the director of None Such Records, she was, in the first half of the 80s, the music director at WNYC, and Steve and Sarah knew her from working with her every day. I had first met her when she wanted to produce a documentary for the 99th birthday of the composer U.B. Blake. And Marty Goldenson, who's in the room, recommended me to her, and she asked me to do it, and we became friends afterwards. I'm mentioning that for just one reason, which is that when it came to finding the voice for the narration and continuity for the documentary, there was no question who we were going to ask, because in the entire radio station, you just wouldn't think of anyone but Steve for that. And it was like that at WBAI and outside, and eventually his voice became a go-to voice for not only program promos for programs on the air, but voiceovers, narration, continuity, TV and radio commercials, audio books, and more on that in a moment. So he really became a kind of a standard for, you know, the kind of radio voice you'd want for things like that. But he was off to an inauspicious debut in that regard, because when Bob invited him into master control from the bookkeeper's desk, and eventually, it wasn't long before he got his own show on the weekends, he started off very much Bob's protege. And so it was one nice radio baritone trying to imitate another one. And when he would, in Bob's fashion, take calls and say, WBAI, you're on the air, it was kind of embarrassing, because initially one caller after another would say, hello, Bob? And he'd have to go, no, this is Steve. Hello, Bob? No, this is Steve. So that's how he started, but he really, he became a standard for a good radio voice as time went on. He was the chief announcer at WBAI for a while, and was very concerned about having people speak the way he thought they should sound on the air. I remember him telling a story years later about his tenure as chief announcer, where he said some new guy came in and he gave him a try and said, you know how to pronounce things? And the guy said, yeah, and he cringed when this trainee read the program announcements and referred to a piece coming up by Antonio Vivaldi. So, anyway, Steve and Nixon. Was he as obsessed in reality as he seemed to be on the air? So 10 years after I had been hearing him being mistaken for Bob, in 1975, I walked into WBAI. I'd had some experience, a fair amount, in print journalism, but no radio. And I wanted to give it a try. And I went over to Bonnie Bello, who was the public affairs director and is in the house, and said, so how do I get going? And to my great pleasure, then and probably forever, she said, well, have you heard of Steve Post? I said, yes. And she said, the first anniversary of Nixon's resignation is coming up in a couple of months, and he wants to do a big documentary. He needs someone to work with. So I said, oh boy, will I do that? And we met, were introduced, and started talking, and realized that we were both total Watergate junkies. We'd been plastered to TV, radio, newspapers from when the whole thing came out in early 73 till he resigned in August of 74. And when his resignation cut it short of a full vote on impeachment in the House and a trial in the Senate, we both felt that this was like coitus interruptus for us. So getting to do this, to really dig deep into this all over again, going through 60, 80 hours of hearings, tapes, and all of that was just like a wonderful reprise for us. And I have to say that people might think that a guy like him, who was used to sort of winging it in live radio, might not have been like this, but when it came to his sense of what should be in and should be out, and his sense of what the edits should be and what should be tighter. No, he was very, very focused, really like a good documentarian should be. And it was an aspect of him that you wouldn't necessarily think would be, excuse me, likely for a live radio guy. When he left WBAI, and after a short stint as the news reader at night on WBLS, he went to WNYC. Oh no, let me go back. Nixon and the obsession. So after this was over, he went out to California. Nixon had retired to San Clemente, and he used to hang out on the beach hoping for a glimpse of him. When Nixon moved back here to East 65th Street, we used to go over and hang out on the street hoping for a glimpse of him. So he got, you know, what he probably had been hoping for all his life when Karen Frillman, who's in the house and had been a producer at WNYC, and is again now, but was then working as a producer of audiobooks, her publisher got the rights to the new Nixon book. And she arranged it for Steve to do some of the narration. So he got to go out to Upper Saddle River, somewhere in Northeast Jersey, where Nixon lived. He got to be in his house. He got to shake his hand, talk to him. The handshake is memorialized in a photo on his bookshelf, reminiscent of the photo that a lot of you have probably seen of Nixon with Elvis Presley. Two guys standing stiffly staring at side by side, staring at the camera, not each other, and shaking hands without looking at each other. So as far as his Nixon obsession, all I can say is that if Laura were to remove all of his Nixon books and photos and memorabilia from the shelves, she'd be staring at a pretty empty apartment right now. So he went to WNYC, and at that time, NYC, as well as a lot of the major NPR stations in the Northeast, was in a morning music monopoly. There was a show emanating from Boston. Some people liked it. Some, I can't be the only one who found it insufferably pompous, but in any case, it was one person's taste and one person's style of presentation that was so much his show that no matter where you are, you put on an NPR station in the morning, it's that. No radio station's individual identity, it was that. So Steve took that on. He started his own program. His presentation, he wasn't the most learned classical music presenter, but he did all right. He pronounced names. He had room for his little wry sense of humor and one-liners here and there, and this very distinctive personal newscast that he did. And basically what it did was, for the morning, it gave WNYC-FM its own identity, and it was just not just another NPR station. Later, Leonard and Brian did something similar with the AM, and there's been more since. But basically, I think it was Steve more than anyone who got NYC on its way to, being its own thing and not just another NPR station in the Northeast. The kindly Uncle Steve, Uncle is something that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think about him. When my wife Linda and I started our relationship, we were at WBAI and he was the manager, and he took a proprietary interest. He felt he was the boss and we had to be responsible to him for our behavior. And that included going away a few times. And years later, we went off with him in the summer to Maine, and by then we had a 5-month-old daughter, and you could see as we left the apprehensiveness in his eyes, wondering, what's this going to be like? So the kid, from the moment the car started till we got to wherever we were going that night and we're getting out of the car, she slept the entire time. The next day in the car to the next, she slept. We went out at night for dinner or a drink. From the time we got to the place till the time we left, she slept. Not a peep out of her. And he was just flabbergasted. He said, "What a wonderful child." So a few years later, she's 3 or 4 and going to preschool, and Linda and I were both working in the daytime, and he finished at NYC at noon. He was back on the west side at 1. And one afternoon a week, we needed somebody to pick her up from preschool and walk her to her after-school thing at the Y. And he said he would do it. And every week, he'd pick her up, get her an ice cream, deliver her to the Y. And he would quack at her, as I quack, quack all the time. As befits, I guess, somebody who famously once had a talking duck as a guest on his radio show, who also, by the way, may be in the house. So much so that she began to call him the duck. And a couple of years later, her sister was born, and from then on, for the next 20 years, till maybe 2 weeks before he died, when he could barely talk anymore, he literally finished every phone conversation with me by saying, his last words were always, "Give a quack to the girls for me." So the last thing I want to say is, you know him as a cynic, as a pessimist, a self-described coward, and he was all of those, but keep this in mind. He had an operation, a major operation for cancer when he was 39, and in the next 25 years, 2 more of that sort, and another one for a major abdominal blockage, 4 major surgeries, and each time he came back and his old sense of humor was restored, and he was the same guy. And, you know, only the last time when it was just beyond the pale and, you know, beyond him or anyone else to recuperate, did he, and even then he tried to get back to being who he was and had the same sense of humor until finally it was over. But I think that he wouldn't have seen himself as strong and courageous and having a drive to stay alive and a will to live. But how else do you explain it? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Your talk reminds me of some additional things that Steve did that are not in the nature of skepticism and wit. Before coming to WBAI, I worked in the offices of the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, active in the peace movement and in civil rights. And it was there that he met people like Bayard Rustin and A.J. Muste. And the experience and values he derived from it informed his radio work, attracting, among others, the friendship of Marjorie Guthrie, the wife of Woody Guthrie, and the mother of Nora Guthrie, from whom we'll hear later this evening, and Carolyn Goodman, with whom he maintained a friendship throughout the rest of her life. He produced a powerful documentary on Muste and an extended, sympathetic interview with a blind transsexual known only as Debbie. On a lighter note, so to speak, an on-location documentary on the Tivoli Player Piano Emporium and its owner, for whom the 19th century had never ended, but had simply gone on into 6 decades of extra innings. James Irsay contributed to that. And of course, you all know, as Richard spoke of his fixation with Richard Nixon, and the show that he described, The Last Nixon Show, received a very prestigious award, the San Francisco State University Best Media Award. And then there were the tributes. He produced to Bayard Rustin, to Alan Lomax, and to Pete Seeger on Pete's 84th birthday. And I could go on, and I'll bet you think I will, but I'll stop there and introduce our next speaker. Humorist, speaker, radio commentator, and Harvard grad, Emily Levine combines 2 outstanding talents. She connects big ideas with our everyday lives, the Milky Way with the Beltway. the larger universe of the cosmos with the smaller universes of home and workplace. And secondly, she makes it funny. Though her real ambition was to become an oracle, she settled for a career as a stand-up comedian, headlining in comedy clubs and making television appearances on such shows as David Letterman's Late Show. Newsweek called her one of the new queens of comedy. Her mother called her every week. An old friend of Steve and Laura, Emily was a frequent guest on the No Show, and each appearance was funnier than the last. Here's Emily.
It's a beautiful day here in Bolinas. The sun is shining, the birds are singing. I couldn't have picked a setting more antithetical to the spirit of the man I want to commemorate here today, Steve Post. It's not that I never saw Steve outside. I have a vivid image of him walking down the street to meet me for lunch, that distinctive hauteur, the lumbering gait, head pitched forward, leaning in, sort of like a cross between a moose and Sheryl Sandberg. But the Steve I remember most was the Steve I had the privilege of seeing when I guested many times on his radio show, in the sound booth, headphones on, blocking out all extraneous noise, the microphone in front of him, and there, Steve was transformed. He looked like the head of Caesar on a Roman coin, noble, kind, generous, loyal. And that, I know, is how his audience saw him, because Steve, besides being brilliant, mellifluous, funny, one of a kind, incredibly original, had a special power. When he spoke through that microphone, everything else disappeared. The script, the clock, his whereabouts, it was like the collapse of the wave function. Only one reality remained: his connection to the audience. And that connection was so profound, beyond what we who Twitter and Instagram and Tumblr like clothes in a dryer will ever know. He gave his audience the gift of his undivided attention, and they knew it, and they loved him. So while noble, generous, kind, loyal may not be the first words that came to mind when I thought of Steve outside the studio, those words would have been more Yiddish, like Luftmensch or Vermischt or Kvetchy. When I think now of what it cost Steve to come to have lunch with me or to see my shows, which he did with Laura faithfully, when I think what it cost him to push past his limitations, to face the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to, although in Steve's case there were probably 1 million just between his apartment and Broadway, I realize what a truly kind, noble, loyal, generous friend he was. I will miss him dearly. And my only comfort is knowing that of anybody in the world, there is no one who was more deserving of the chance to rest in peace.
Right about now, I'm feeling a very strange need, an uncanny compulsion, you might even say, to interrupt tonight's proceedings to welcome an unscheduled guest who has, after all, earned this spot by making a very long journey to be here.
Well, that's what you get for having an uncanny compulsion.
Instead of this unscheduled guest, who will perhaps make an appearance later, we have another extraordinary character, a pianist, a raconteur, a radio man like no other, and a very, very good friend of Steve Post. James Irsay, are you in the house?
And that was part of a concert that took place at the Free Music Store last night, featuring James Irsay and the New York Philharmonic, conducted Leo Tolstoy.
Steve Post and I produced shows together. We took road trips. We spent time on the air. We pitched for funds together. But our real adventure, our only true adventures, were adventures in friendship. Basically, it was love at first sight with Post and I, in a friendship way of speaking. We were young enough to fall for new people enthusiastically, and we did just that. As soon as we met, we started meeting frequently, often. There really are not that many. I remember the time that Post, or once we went to, it was really just a long continuum of warm feelings. And by the way, when Sarah was mentioning that she was on a last name basis with Post, it was the same way with us, except when we would communicate by telephone, and the greeting always, without ever wavering or differing, was, "Hello, schmuck. Hey, schmuck." It just seemed to be natural. Really, my memories of Steve are just a long continuum of warm feelings of friendship. You would hear that from many people, how warm and sincere he was, how he always gave you that eagle-eye attention. We really didn't know the bitingly sarcastic person that Post was on the air, but we knew warm mockery frequently, gentle mockery. He treated his friends carefully. He acted as if he were the lucky one with all of his friends, not realizing that we all knew that we were really the lucky ones. We began hanging out during Post's stint doing The Outside, his late night radio program. After we met, I would tag along in the studio in the dimly lit master control of WBAI on East 62nd Street. I'd never done any radio at all. I'd never been behind a microphone, and I was astonished at what I saw Post do. He would let me take readings, transmitter readings that had to be done every hour. And in 62nd Street, there was a little click thing, and it recorded the power, vertical and horizontal, as Post would say, vertical, horizontal, depending upon whether you're lying down or standing up. He would take phone calls. And again, I was astonished. Listeners would line up, it seems, at their telephones, waiting to be warmly, fakely abused by Steve. He would answer, BAI, you're on the air. Hello, Steve? Yeah, Steve. With such contempt in his voice, but it wasn't real contempt. It was loving contempt. And that's what they called for. They knew him. Radio, as you've heard, is an intimate kind of medium. And these people needed Steve's mocking, caustic friendship. And they ate it up. Ultimately, I was scheduled for my own show on WBAI. And before I did it, before the debut, Post and I went up to his house in Rhinebeck. He had a little country mobile home that was fixed in one place on the top of a little hill in a back lot in Rhinebeck, New York. We would go up there and drink fine wine. We'd test each other, have blind tastings. In fact, we made up the name of a blues singer for that, Blind Vin Tastin'. I'd hold up pour a glass of a Merlot and challenge Steve to guess what it was, and I'd hold the glass up and he'd look at it and say, it's a red wine. Well, the subject of my upcoming show came up, and we were curious how it would go. And as it happens, he had a Ouija board there. And we took out the Ouija board, opened it up, fired it up, and asked it the question, so how is Irsay's show going to turn out on Friday morning? And we put our hands on the little thing, it was a pointer with a little see-through thing so you could see the letters and numbers. We sat there, and after a while, H. O. T. Pause. S. H. I. And you can fill in the rest. Hot shit is what the Ouija board told us. And we felt great about that, and we're astounded that this thing apparently was actually working. Post and I continued to celebrate our friendship through the years. I would visit very often with Post, with Laura, together, sharing the bed with Laura and Steve. Laura would be lying next to Steve on the bed in their apartment, and I would be on the foot of the bed. I would never sit in a chair. And if poor Laura would happen to get up and go to the kitchen or something, she'd come back and I'd be lying next to Steve. And she'd have to chase me away back to the foot of the bed. At one point early on, Post and I decided that we were going to tell the audience that we were going to get married in Sheep Meadow in a big celebration. And you know what? I mean, these are just two guys who were thrilled at being friends and just had to tell the world. We really loved each other. We didn't have to prove it in any way. It just happened. It lasted until the last. And I've never had another friendship like that. Never will. That's okay. I'm not looking for one. But it's very pleasing to see how many people there are here tonight to honor my dear, dear, dear friend Stevie, and thank you all for coming.
But I wanted to know how to play the piano, and my mother and father, who knew me well, I will admit, said, come on, you know you'll never be able to play the piano, you're incompetent, you'll take it, we'll buy you a piano, we'll spend on you the money, and then 2 weeks later you'll give it up and we'll waste the money and everything. And I said, no, I really want to play the piano. I had seen, you know what inspired me? I had seen the movie of Chopin's life. The scene that really grabbed me in the Chopin movie, I don't know how many of you saw it, was where he's very sick, he has tuberculosis or something, but he goes on anyway to give this concert. The millions of people are waiting for him to give this concert. He goes on and he plays his little heart out, and finally he spits up blood on the keyboard and dies.
Charles Hobson is the founder and artistic director of Vanguard Documentaries. His career in television spans 4 decades, especially with PBS and BBC. His credits include the series The Africans, a series on international development, Global Links, a science series, Spaces, and Porgy and Bess, An American Voice, Inside Bedford-Stuyvesant, Negroes with Guns, and many, many more. And among his many honors are an Emmy Award, the Japan Prize, Special Citation, the Golden Eagle Award, and a Fulbright Scholarship. And I want to mention one further television credit, the series from Jump Street, History of Black Music. I wanted to add that because when I first met Charles in the 1960s, he was at WBAI as producer and host of the weekly program Negro Music. Let's bring him on to his old theme.
Got me running, you got me hiding, you got me run, hide, run anywhere you wanna let it roll.
This will be a short one, not because I didn't love Steve and enjoy knowing him, and I certainly did. And as Frank pointed out, I was at WBAI from the beginning. I started in 1963. And so anyway, I was thinking about tonight and what I would say, and I couldn't think of anything. What am I going to say? So last night I called Frank. I said, Frank, you got to help me. Could you, 3 words or 3 phrases that wouldn't apply to Steve Post? And he shot ahead. He said, sentimentality, respect for authority, and listening to the advice of experts. And that kind of led me to the last phone conversation I had with Steve. I'm a cancer survivor, and I wanted to talk to him because he had just was released from the hospital. And so anyway, I was talking to Steve, how are things going? He said, well, I just heard from my doctor. And then he listed a bunch of things, and it all sounded really good. Steve, it's terrific. He said, I don't believe a word he said. I said, but Steve, suppose he said a lot of horrible, negative things. That I would believe. So that was Steve, and as you've heard, and he's a wonderful guy. I miss him. I'm here, and I want to get back in my seat and listen to all the things that people are saying. But there's one thing of importance to me that I learned tonight that I wish I could have discussed with him when he was here. Tootsie Pops, cherry. I love those too. Good night.
Okay, so during those two events, we had plenty of time to, how shall I put it, reschedule our unscheduled guest. You remember the one who earned this spot by making a very long journey to be here. Cross your fingers.
Does anybody in the studio at that party have anything nice to say about me?
Yes, of course. I thought we were not on the air. I feel I've been watching you and listening to you now for the last 3 or 4 hours, and I really feel that you will go very, very, very far in your profession. They call me now Brother Theodore. I detest it, but I'm known under the name of Brother. I know that because sometimes people on the street stop me. They don't say Theodore or Brother Theodore. They say Brother. It's disgusting.
For me soon, son of a bitch. Many people search my acquaintanceship because I'm brilliant and charming and continental, and you avoid me like the pestilence. Ever since I heard you have this new girl, damn her. And what about your wife? Isn't she overdue? Or has she come and gone without my knowledge behind my back? Incredible, incredible, incredible. And once we were friends. It's disgusting. When a guy gets old, he's thrown on the scrap heap and everybody avoids him. Probably you fuck Lisa behind my back. I wouldn't be amazed at it at all. And that's why you avoid me, because you would be embarrassed and you don't dare to look straight in my eye after this treachery. Goodbye.
Tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. near West 96th Street, I shall plunge into the Hudson, and shortly thereafter I shall reappear on the coast of New Jersey as a white swan. It will be a miracle, and I will be dancing in the streets, and the establishment hushes it up, of course.
Come on, my friends, let's have some real enjoyment. Good and hot. Come on. Rititi, 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 rititi. Wahaha, 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 wahaha. Rititi, 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 rititi. Wahaha, 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 wahaha.
Il say more.
Robbie Barish, and that's Dr. Barish to you and to me, began at WBAI as a volunteer with our not infrequent on-the-air fundraisers. The early ones offered contributors premiums that were donated gifts we called barters. I still remember a bathtub of tiny turtles, most of whom succumbed during the course of the fundraiser. To the point, Robbie was in charge of this aspect of the drive and was known to all as Robbie Barish Barter Baron. He went on to become an announcer and to become a regular and treasured member of Steve's outside family of participants. For example,
things are improving here. Things are improving as they go along. Well, Robbie's just re-entered the room, folks. They've wheeled him in on his portable stretcher, his sodium cyclamate bottle above his head. And so while Robbie Barish is inside fashioning from old popsicle sticks a microphone, why don't you go over there by that microphone? You can use a handheld microphone.
Popsicle sticks. That's an idea. I'll have to try it. As Frank mentioned, I came to WBAI early. I was still a sophomore at NYU in the Bronx. That's important that it was the Bronx. And I volunteered until 1966, when I actually was hired onto the announcing staff. A rite of passage for people who came to the radio station to actually be accepted enough to be invited to become a staff member. And I was very innocent and lacked experience in almost every element of life at that time. Because I was a student, the only realistic time that I could work as an announcer on the station was the weekend. And so they gave me 4 to midnight on Saturday and Sunday. This meant that I was the precedent for the outside. And so anytime Steve was late, or anytime Steve was absent, it fell upon me to either fill in with one of what came to be known as Robbie Miscellanies, or to help as an engineer with substitute guest hosts for the program. But aside from that, Steve mentions in his book, Playing in the FM Band, the fact that the announcing job at most radio stations and at WBAI back then was one of pretty much solitude. You're basically locked into a soundproof room with nothing there except a microphone that you have control over and means of reproducing sound with either tape or records or now, of course, CDs, all under your control. And in fact, you become the final arbiter of what goes over the air. Now, obviously, you don't choose it yourself. Producers have spent a lot of time and effort putting it together, but you really do have the ultimate authority in terms of being in charge of the radio station. And it's something that is quite unique in terms of that position, and one in which I felt the isolation was comforting, to be locked in that room, dim out the lights, and just think, there's no one but you, no one there. Steve, however, let it be known that as far as he was concerned, I was part of the family in a way that was manifest in all kinds of different things, including the little clip you just heard, but more often than not, it was as a technical assistant. It has been mentioned earlier tonight that there were various things that needed to be done when you're on the air, like taking transmitter power readings, the 5.85 kilowatts vertical and 3.85 kilowatts horizontal. Sorry, 5.4 kilowatts vertical and 3.85 kilowatts horizontal. So I would do that. And in addition to that, if tapes needed to be mounted for the delay system, which was an unbelievable, strange invention, where you actually had two tape recorders, one here, one there, with the tape being recorded over here, traveling about 3 or 4 feet over to the other tape recorder over here to be played back, such that there was a delay of several seconds in between. That became WBAI's delay system for bleeping out bleepable words. So I would set that up and maintain it. All the while becoming more ingratiated into whatever was going on those Saturday and Sunday nights, and being made welcome by Steve to do that. In 1967, when Laura arrived on the scene, I would enjoy Steve's own moments of solitude by going to the back of the 39th Street station and spending time with Laura. And so we became good friends, and I became good friends with Steve, who at the end of Saturday and Sunday nights would, if there were no conflicting items on the agenda, would put me in his Volkswagen and drive me back to my little home with my roommates in the Bronx near the NYU campus. My one final observation I would like to make, which has been touched on by others here, is about Steve's humanity and generosity. And I would like to add to that his bravery. And I would like to just remind you something that James, I think, said, or Richard Barr said. Steve was diagnosed with colon cancer at a relatively young age, more than 30 years ago. And he went through tremendous amounts of pain and suffering and difficulty, both with the surgical consequences and the radiation therapy consequences, of which I have to admit, although not responsible for it myself, I participated as the head physicist of the radiation oncology department at NYU at the time. And then after that, and the subsequent difficulties, when he had the lung tumors and the years of suffering with that, you can only imagine what it takes for someone with that kind of diagnosis and with that kind of history to be the person that all of us and all of you know him to be. Inside, that requires a tremendous amount of strength and courage. So to that, we add the fact that in my case, and in the case of many others, he was able to take someone who needed affection and who needed consolation and who needed support and provide that unquestionably and freely in ways that, unless you were part of that, you can only hear about and never fully understand. But for those of us who were the recipients of Steve's love and affection, it was wonderful, amazing, and will certainly be missed. Thank you. Oh. And now I have a task. I get to do an announcing job for our next guest, who will be presented, as we used to say. The following will come to you on recording. This is a musical artist who is one of Steve's favorite performers, whom I remember very well in 1967 at the Village Theater benefit concert for WBAI. Steve introduced her. She came out, she performed one song, and her microphone was slightly out of position like this. And I had the temerity to run out on the stage and put it into the right place, earning me her enmity forever. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Judy Collins.
my time together. Take the rugged sunny days, the warm and rocky weather. Take the roads that I have walked along, looking for tomorrow's time. Peace of mind. As my life spills into yours, changing with the hours, filling up the world with time, turning time to flowers. I can show you all the songs that I never sang to one man before. We have seen a million stones lying by the water. You have climbed the hills with me to the mountain shelter, taken off the days one by one, setting them to breathe in the sun. Take the lilies and the lace from the days of childhood, all the willow winding paths leading up and outward. This is what I give, this is what I ask you for. Nothing
Post had a feel for authenticity in music, as we know. And once he got going in a radio studio, he would let loose with recordings of great blues singers and folk singers, including the incomparable Woody Guthrie. Woody's daughter, Nora, who's also incomparable, sent us some tape. Nora Guthrie.
Steve, if by any chance you're tuned into this station today, I just wanted to tell you how special you were in my life. For lots of reasons, but just for starters, you were one of the rare radio voices I could tolerate. You said what you meant and meant what you said, and you teased us all trying to figure out what it was you really meant and dared to say on the air. You were the only one that kept the voices of my father's friends, like Leadbelly, out there when everyone else was consuming the corporate artist of the day. And just another funny thing, when I married my husband, who was a radio producer from Germany, he came to live in New York. He was pretty stunned at how bad and how low the standard radio chit-chat was here, and pretty disgusted with the whole thing. Luckily, one day, I turned the channel to the No Show, and he was hooked, and you possibly saved my marriage. And the only celebrity he ever asked me to introduce him to was Steve Post. Yours was a voice of unreason, which in times like this, that are all mixed up, upside down, and bizarre, translated into the rare voice of reason, having something to say, and a mind we thoroughly enjoyed listening to. And Michael's favorite moment of the week, when you introduced No Things Considered at the end of your show. No way, nowhere, no how will there ever be another you.
Brian Lehrer, WNYC's longtime radio host, in fact now celebrating 25 years of the Brian Lehrer Show, couldn't be here today, but he sent us these words and asked me to read them. For most of my teen years, Steve Post was whom I wanted to be when I grew up. I wanted to be Steve because he said the most interesting things and played the best music of anyone I listened to on the radio in those WBAI days. And the way he did it helped convince me, and probably a lot of other high school kids sitting alone in their rooms like me, that there was a wider world out there to connect to with more misfits like me than I had previously thought. He even got me to make my first pledge to a public radio station in the middle of one night. And yes, I did send in what I pledged, all $5 in cash. So we thank you, Brian, for those words and for the $5, which we could always use. Neil Conan. Neil Conan started his radio career volunteering at WBAI at age 17, where he met and worked with Steve Post, of all people. From these shaky roots, he grew to become a longtime NPR journalism star, reporting as their defense and national security correspondent and acting as senior editor at the London Bureau, executive producing All Things Considered and hosting numerous NPR programs, including a long and distinguished stint as host of Talk of the Nation. And now this. Neil, are you in the house?
Like many of you, I met Steve on the radio, and I remember the event with great precision. It was May 1966. I was a high school student and stuck at home. At the time, I was living in my father's office. He was a doctor. He had an office on First Avenue and 81st Street. And I was living in the office. I've lived in a lot of places since. That was the strangest. But anyway, the only entertainment... I'm just talking to this thing here. Is that it? The only entertainment in the office was an FM radio that he had on WTFM during the day to subdue the screams from the examination room. And you remember radio in those days, many of you do. AM radio was pretty much, hey, time to pack the wax and hit the tracks. And FM radio was, you're so fortunate to be living in the city of fine music. One day, I'm tuning on this FM radio in my father's office, and all of a sudden I hear something I had never heard before. I heard people talking in normal tones of voice. Women's voices. You never heard women's voices on the radio in those days. I heard people telling bad jokes. That was Steve. I heard people telling me they needed me to help a radio station. And I was absolutely hooked. I raced back the next day only to discover that something horrible had happened. They made the goal. So instead of this magic of this chaos that I'd been listening to and fallen in love with, I was listening to a panel discussion on the reverse income tax recorded at the Contra Costa Country Club in Contra Costa County, Contra Costa, California, followed by a commentary by Ayn Rand. It took me about 4 months to find the radio station. Again, it was the same station. I just had to wait until night, and I heard Bob Fast. And then on Saturday night, I heard Steve Post. Fast forward, I became probably the greasiest of greasy volunteers at WBAI, and learned that as long as no task was too demeaning, you could hang around and people would teach you stuff. And I remember sitting alone in edit control in 39th Street, looking through the studio into master control, and there was the august chief announcer, Steve Post, in that big black chair behind the console. And he opened the microphone and he said, "You're tuned to WBAI at 99.5 FM in New York City, and we are now," pause, 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 exactly 15 minutes behind schedule. And I said to myself, I have got to do that. So only after a couple of months of pestering, Steve agreed to let the kid have a tryout. And so he took me into that sacrosanct room, master control, and put me in that black chair. And he said, "Now you know what to do. The tape is running out on machine 1. You take down the pot when it's finished, hold the take-up reel until the arm falls down so it won't make too much noise. You key the mic, open the mic, you say the station ID, you close the mic, open tape 3, bang. I was going to be on the air 12 seconds. I say, yep, I got it, Steve. I'm all set. He leaves the room, walks down that long record library that led to edit control and into the studio, and he's staying there in a corner where I can't see him, because he knows I'm going to make me nervous. I didn't need him to make me nervous. My hands are like this. I'm sitting in that chair, and I am just vibrating. So inevitably, the tape runs out. All right, one down, hold the tape. Key the mic, open the mic, and I piss myself. Not long, but it turned out the act of shutting that orifice shut every orifice. So I proceeded to announce, you're at WBAI. Steve's back there, and he says to himself and all sundry, this kid is never going to make it. Steve, nevertheless, forgave me my mistakes, and that was hardly the only one. That Vivaldi, that was me. But he gave me a chance. Robbie was talking about the afternoon shifts on the weekends. I got the Saturday and Sunday morning shifts and fell in love with Anthony Boucher and the World of Opera and Henry Cowell and the Music of the World's People and all the wonderful programs, though I did learn that while it was lovably eccentric for Larry to show up late Monday through Friday, that was not held in the same esteem if the Saturday and Sunday morning announcer showed up late for the morning concert. Anyway, it was the first step on a long road of perdition that we call public broadcasting. And Steve had the guts to hire a kid he knew from nowhere. We became great friends, and I've heard him described as a lot of things tonight, all of them true. Pain in the ass, curmudgeon, wonderful friend, a great broadcaster. I have to add something else. Steve Post was a mensch. Thank you very much.
I first met Julius Lester in 1964 during the Southern Civil Rights Movement. He was a photographer for SNCC and a musician. In fact, his first book, the first of 40 so far, was The Folk Singer's Guide to this 12-string guitar as played by Leadbelly. That was the title. It was co-written with Pete Seeger. It never made the Times list. His next book caused a bit more of a stir by the title alone. Look out, Whitey, Black Power gon' get your mama. I later had the great pleasure to work with him at WBAI, where he broadcast from 1968 to 1975, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, sometimes to substantial controversy. Julius joined the faculty of the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in 1971, teaching African American studies. After converting to Judaism, he joined the university's Judaic and Near Eastern Studies Department. In all, he spent 32 years at the University of Massachusetts, retiring in 2003. There's a lot more to be said about Julius, his photography exhibitions, his 2 recordings of folk music and original compositions, but you could Google it in far less time than I could say it. Steve has some of it to say, too.
Julius and I
see your new tattoo, a soul brother, right on your wrist.
Not only haven't I criticized Julius, but I said on this very same program several months back that if Julius was dismissed from the station, that I would quit because I supported him fully. I don't criticize Julius.
You're a man of principle, Steve.
Well, I'm not a man of principle. I just had complete assurance that they weren't going to dismiss him.
This is Julius Lester. I can't say that I knew Steve well. I didn't. I left New York and WBAI in 1975. And in the ensuing 40 years, Steve and I had little contact. Yet, I remained aware of events in his life and I'm certain he remained aware of events in mine. One does not have to see or talk to someone for there to be an enduring connection. As I've thought about and remembered Steve over the months since his death, it is not his sense of humor that has come to mind. I never totally understood his humor. As I wrote in the foreword to Steve's book, Playing in the FM Band, A Personal Account of Free Radio, quote, I was uncomfortable listening to him, hating him, because he satirized blacks, women, peace marchers, and anyone else he felt was a little too self-righteous about a particular grievance, end quote. He was rude to people who called into his show and put down, quote, pompous intellectuals, ridiculed the too serious, and hung up eagerly on the boring, end quote. Yet, I found myself compelled to listen to his show on Saturday and Sunday nights. And when, in the summer of 1968, I met him and served as guest host of the show when he was away for much of that summer, I found that I liked him, and I became fond of him. My enduring memory of Steve belies his image as a curmudgeon. Some of you may remember that in late 1969, an anti-Semitic poem was read on my then Thursday night show. This was during a time when there was a struggle taking place between the United Federation of Teachers and blacks in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville section of Brooklyn over the issue of community control of schools. The poem read on my show had been written by a student from one of those schools. The radio station and I came under intense attack from New York newspapers and television stations from doing our job, namely practicing free speech. The Jewish Defense League organized a demonstration outside the station against me on a night they knew I was going to be on the air. The station was on 39th Street then, and as I turned off Park Avenue and started down the block that night, I saw the street was blocked off, and several hundred very angry people were behind police barricades in front of the station. I asked the policeman at the corner of 39th and Park if he would escort me down the block. He said he couldn't leave his position. So I started down the street, alone and a little bit apprehensive. However, as I neared the station, the door opened, and who should come walking toward me but Steve Post. As he did so, he got the policeman guarding the station to form a phalanx around me. Before the demonstrators realized what was happening, Steve and the police escorted me inside. In the next morning's Daily News was a photograph of me entering the station, and there, behind me, unidentified, was Steve Post. While Steve presented himself publicly as a curmudgeon, I suspect he did so to protect himself from a heart that felt the world too deeply, from an acute mind that could not make sense of his cruelties, from a sensitivity that caused him to feel more pain than he knew how to endure. In the great tradition of comedy, Steve helped others to laugh, to keep himself from crying. Steve would appreciate the irony of this. As he knew, I converted to Judaism 33 years ago. So I, the black man accused of anti-Semitism, that Steve, the non-observant Jew, helped protect from angry Jews, I will light a yahrzeit candle in your memory on the 7th of Av, the date of your death on the Hebrew calendar. Thank you for being you, Steve Post. As we say in Hebrew, Zichrono Livraha, his memory is a blessing.
Marilyn Sokol was brought up to WBAI when it was on 39th Street in around 1969 or 70, and a long, fruitful relationship ensued. She's an Emmy, Obie, and Bistro Award winner, most recently starring in the off-Broadway production of Old Jews Telling Jokes. And she celebrates her 49th year this year in show business and counts her time with Steve Post as a high point. Is Marilyn here? Okay.
Hi, Steve.
How are you?
Hi.
What have you been doing lately?
Hi, Steve.
How are you?
Fine.
What have you been doing lately?
Hi, Steve.
How's the wife?
Fine.
Hi.
That's my machine.
Okay. Is that your machine? That's a very nice machine. Would you turn it off for a second? Does it do anything else? Does it say
Yes.
anything else?
Ask it another question. I'll turn it
Oh,
off.
hold it. Can I ask it like a political question?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Who's going to be the next governor of New York State?
Hi, Steve.
How are you?
Fine.
Just turn it off again for a second. I realize that I can ask it other questions, but will it give me other answers ever, do you think?
Maybe if I slip another card into the hole. Just a second, I'll take one out and I'll put it in. Ask it.
Hi.
I like the Steve Post show.
What's your favorite thing on radio?
WBAI.
Who do you think is going to be governor of New York State?
I like the Steve Post show.
Well, would you turn it off again, please? That's nice, but every time you ask it a new question, you just put in a disc and you can get two questions. Is that it?
Well,
Did
yes.
you pay a lot for this machine?
I did.
I don't really think it's worth it. Does it do anything else?
Well, it massages me.
And that's all you get of Marshall tonight. Unfortunately, Marshall Lefron was ill and was not able to attend, but you got a little bit of him right there. And then he was supposed to introduce Marilyn Sokol, but Sarah already did that, and so I give you, once again, Marilyn Sokol.
Thank you. I'm wondering, is that me? No. Anyway, it's a bittersweet, of course, event for me and most, I think. When Marshall brought me up to WBAI, on our way, he said to me, I'll be Frank Joe Franklin, and you be Frida Gatzinger, who was a Shamtuzi. And I chose to sing There's No Business Like Show Business at the piano, singing off-key like Joe Stafford, I think it was, and playing the best way that I could, which is discordant accompaniment of There's No Business Like Show Business. Should I do it? Can I? This became my theme song on The Wounded End, an optimistic title as opposed to The Dead End. It was a statement. And so somehow I was introduced. Maybe we went on as guests of Steve's. Anyway, when Marshall was otherwise engaged, I would be a guest. And Steve had this wonderful way of talking to my characters. Smoochy Farkas, how do you do? Name's Rosa Rita Farkas, but you could call me Smoochy. And the way that as I was sitting and standing, listening to people reminiscing, you know, because we moved from the Bronx when I was 6 years old. And oh, by the way, I noticed tonight that I am 2 days short of being Steve's elder. That I was born February 22nd, 44, and he was born March 20th, 44. So perhaps that explains something. In any event, he had a way of talking to me and talking to these characters who sprang from my eternal unconscious, subconscious, whatever, like a relative, like maybe these nurturing relatives, this nurturing uncle that I didn't really get a chance to perform for when I was very little, because we moved away. We moved to Mount Rainier, Maryland, a hotbed of anti-Semitism. And then Washington, D.C. So he was, I'm going to use a word that has not been used this evening, nurturing. He was nurturing to me. And so I developed a crush. But it was always Laura, you know. Always. So I just have to say thank you. I feel kind of bereft because my career took me away from WBAI and Steve and that connection. It's like, you know, show business is a harsh taskmaster. And so we did have communication occasionally, but I certainly do envy the relationships that people have described. It's great to see David Amram, someone I did go out with a little. I was working as a waitress in a restaurant which is now NYU. And
what is it?
And I was only there for 2 weeks because I got fired for kissing and hugging the patrons too much. But David came in with Charlie Mingus, and I recognized David, and I said, "Oh, Mr. Amram," so that we started to date. And I knew Krasner, so Paul, you know, because I was with the San Francisco Mime Troupe, and that was before I knew Steve. This is not a resume, you understand. But I just adore him. It's hard for me to use the past tense. I just adore him. I know how smart he was. I know that when he dealt with the enema lady, who I really didn't know was real or not, that he was tough, you know. But to me, he was a softie, and I just want to hug him. Thank you.
Wonderful. Paul Fisher is a former news director of WBAI, a former news director of KPFA, and 31-year veteran of CBS News, including 24 years as writer and associate producer on the CBS Evening Show with Dan Rather. Paul is a recipient of 11 Writers Guild Awards, one News Emmy, and one Overseas Press Club Award that he and Neil Conan won for their documentary, Northern Ireland, A Month of Bloody Sundays. He has since returned to his roots in public radio as an independent producer and is the host of a weekly hour of narration, music, and sound bites on WBAI entitled, What's the Frequency, Kenneth? It's yours, Paulie.
I'm Paul Fisher. Steve Post was my friend for 50 years, and he'd be the first, maybe the only, to understand my inability to deliver this standing in front of an audience. Steve gave me my first paying job in broadcasting, part-time announcer engineer at WBAI. I forgive you, Steve. Steve gave me my first good advice as a broadcaster. If you don't know how to pronounce something, just mumble it with authority. In the end, I stuck with journalism, Steve stuck with being Steve, to the delight of generations of radio listeners. But you know the media, almost every article about him contained the words sardonic curmudgeon. Perhaps, but Steve was so much more. This sardonic curmudgeon volunteered for years using that great voice doing readings for the blind. And for a sardonic curmudgeon, he sure loved kids and animals, cats, dogs, and a cockatiel named Maria. As for kids, I can tell you one of my son Matt's earliest phrases was, PJs, touch ball, Steve. We were on vacation with Steve and Laura on Cape Cod. PJ's, touch ball, Steve, was Matt's way of saying he wanted to go to PJ's Clam House in Wellfleet, where Steve would lift him up over his shoulders so Matt could reach the round lighting fixtures on the ceiling. PJ's, touch ball, Steve. Steve sometimes meant Steve. Sometimes Steve meant Matt wanted Steve to give him some oyster crackers. Sometime later, Steve, the sardonic curmudgeon, agreed to babysit for Matt on Tuesdays. After a couple of weeks of this, we began to notice that every time Matt stood up from the couch, he would hold his own back and say, Oi. Thanks, Steve. To be sure, like all 50-year friendships, we'd tick each other off from time to time, but always made up, or forgot what we argued about in the first place. Steve, the sardonic curmudgeon, was actually the first radio geek. His show, The Outside, a midnight Saturday show, often dealt with his social awkwardness and growing up chubby in the Bronx. What a radio godsend for everyone home without a date at midnight on a Saturday night. And the Fat-In, one of the great satirical be-ins. At once, Steve making fun of the in-crowd, and a grudging longing to be part of it. In 2006, Steve and I wound up a few floors apart in the same hospital for different ailments. And when we got out, one day, a few weeks after our hospital discharges, we had breakfast at the diner on 72nd and West End. It was such a beautiful day we decided to sit a while on a park bench outside Riverside Park. After a while, I don't remember which one of us started first, we started mumbling the words to this song, one of Steve's theme songs he used at the end of The Outside. Steve, don't worry about being a lonely old man on a park bench, judging from all the friends you made, just some of them here today. Steve Post, sardonic curmudgeon indeed. To paraphrase Steve himself, just when you think you got to the bottom of Steve Post, you've barely scratched the surface.
And I sit here and I worry. I sit here and I wonder whether time will make a lonely old man in the park feeding pigeons on a Thursday afternoon out of me.
Before going into the last lap of this, which is about to happen, I just wanted to, as we thanked people earlier, since Frank was doing some of the thanking, he didn't want to thank himself, and I didn't have the foresight to do it. So we should thank him now, Frank Millspaugh, who spent weeks, I just came to do a little hosting and help out, but Frank has really been on this for weeks, and so we thank him.
making postcards of the hanging. They're painting the passports brown. The beauty parlor is filled with sailors. The circus is in town. Here comes the blind commissioner. They've got him in a trance. One hand is tied to the tightrope walker. The other is in his pants. And the riot squad, they're restless. They need somewhere to go. As Lady and I look out tonight from Desolation Road. Cinderella, she seems so easy. It takes one to know one. She smiles and puts her hands in her back pocket, Betty Davis style. And in comes Romeo, he's moaning, "You belong to me, I believe." And someone says, "You're in the wrong place, my friend. You'd better leave." And the only sound that's left after the ambulances go is Cinderella sweeping up on Desolation Road. Now the moon is almost hidden. The stars are beginning to hide. The fortune-telling lady has even taken all her things inside, all except for Cain and Abel and the hunchback of Notre Dame. Everybody is making love or else expecting rain. And the Good Samaritan, he's dressing, he's getting ready for the show. He's going to the carnival tonight on Desolation Road. Ophelia, she's 'neath the window. For her I feel so afraid. On her 22nd birthday, she already is an old maid. To her death is quite romantic. She wears an iron vest. Her profession's her religion. Her sin is her lifelessness. And though her eyes are fixed upon Noah's great rainbow, she spends her time peeking into Desolation Road. Einstein disguised as Robin Hood, with his memories in a trunk, passed this way an hour ago with his friend, a jealous monk. Now he looked so immaculately frightful as he bummed a cigarette. Then he went off sniffing drain pipes and reciting the alphabet. You would not think to look at him, but he was famous long ago for playing the electric violin on Desolation Road. Dr. Filth, he keeps his world inside of a leather cup, but all his sexless patients, they are trying to blow it up. Now his nurse, some local loser, she's in charge of the cyanide hole, and she also keeps the cards that read, "Have mercy on his soul." They all play on the penny whistle, you can hear them blow. If you lean your head out far enough from Desolation Row. Across the street, they've nailed the curtains. They're getting ready for the feast. The Phantom of the Opera in a perfect image of a priest. Here are spoon-feeding Casanova to get him to feel more assured. Then they'll kill him with self-confidence after poisoning him with words. And the Phantom shouting to skinny girls, "Get out of here if you don't know." Casanova is just being punished for going to Desolation Row. At midnight, all the agents and the superhuman crew come out and round up everyone that knows more than they do. Then they bring them to the factory where the heart attack machine is strapped across their shoulders, and then the kerosene is brought down from the castles by insurance men who go check to see that nobody is escaping to Desolation Row. Praise be to Nero's Neptune, the Titanic sails at dawn. Everybody's shouting, which side are you on? And Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot fighting in the captain's tower, while calypso singers laugh at them and fishermen hold flowers. Between the windows of the sea where lovely mermaids flow, and nobody has to think too much about Desolation Row. I received your letter yesterday about the time the doorknob broke. When you asked me how I was doing, was that some kind of joke? All these people that you mentioned, yes, I know them, they're quite lame. I had to rearrange their faces and give them all another name. Don't send me no more letters, no. Not unless you mail them from Desolation Road.
So you're going to just let me read it by myself?
Yeah.
Okay.
At this time,
At this-
WBAI concludes...
No,
another-
myself.
What? Yeah,
My-
right, myself.
Myself, okay.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
At this time, WBAI concludes
another day of non-commercial radio
I have to
broadcasting.
turn off his microphone again.
WBAI
is owned and operated by the Pacifica Foundation, which is a non-profit educational institution operating non-commercial stations in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and once again, Houston areas. We operate on channel 258 at 99.5 megacycles with an effective radiated power of 5.4 kilowatts horizontal and think they're dropping off like flies, and 3.85 kilowatts vertical. But this is symbolic and sentimental, depending upon whether you're lying down or standing
where
up.
is our transmitter located?
With the reluctant authority of the Federal Communications Commission.
Oftentimes called the Federal Communist Conspiracy.
Right. Our transmitter is located in the Empire State Building, high atop the Empire State
Do you
Building.
remember in the movie King Kong?
Yeah.
And he was in Pacifica.
Well, he used to be
was
our
like-
chief engineer, as a matter of fact.
Across the morning sky, all the birds are leaving. Ah, how can they know it's time